The Jamaican sun hung heavy over the sugarcane fields, casting long shadows that stretched over the rows of slaves bent low, their hands blistered and their bodies soaked in sweat. The air was thick with the scent of earth and sugar, a bitter aroma that clung to the skin and choked the lungs. But it was not the heat or the work that weighed on the slaves' shoulders, it was the oppression, the crushing weight of living under the constant lash of their masters. In the distance, the grand house of the plantation stood tall, its white walls a stark contrast to the blood-stained dirt below. The masters lived in luxury, surrounded by the fruits of the slaves' endless labor, while those who worked the fields were treated like animals, beaten, starved, and driven into the ground with every strike of the overseer's whip. Among the workers, there was one whose resolve had never wavered, Jihari. His body was carved from years of brutal labor, but his mind remained sharp, his spirit unbroken. He was a man of silence, of patience. He had learned to endure, to wait for the right moment, the moment when he would rise up and strike back. That moment was coming. The days of bending under the lash had come to an end. The time for patience was over. The revolt had begun. Before we move deeper into the heart of Jihari's rebellion, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below, and if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in the sugar fields of Jamaica for far too long. The sun was a brutal overseer, hanging high in the sky, suffocating the land with its oppressive heat. The sugarcane fields of Jamaica stretched out for miles, a sea of green stalks swaying gently in the breeze, yet the beauty of the land was lost on those who toiled beneath it. For the enslaved men and women, the fields were not a place of life or growth. They were a prison, an endless cycle of back-breaking labor that served only to feed the wealth of their masters. Among the workers was Jihari, a man whose body had been shaped by years of grueling labor, and whose mind had been sharpened by a life of constant suffering. His skin was dark and weathered from the sun, his hands calloused from hours of cutting the cane. He had spent his entire life on these fields, and yet, despite the weight of his chains, he was different from the others. Where the other slaves had been broken, had bent to the will of their masters, Jihari had learned to endure, to wait. He was a man who lived on the edge of silence, observing everything and saying nothing until now. The overseers rode through the rows of cane, their eyes scanning the slaves for any sign of weakness, any reason to strike with their whips. They were cruel men, their faces hardened by years of authority and the power they held over the lives of the enslaved. But they didn't see Jihari. They didn't see the fire that burned inside him, a fire that had been slowly growing, fed by the injustices he had witnessed every single day. He watched them, the overseers, and the masters who lived in the grandeur of their estates, while the slaves beneath them bled and died for their wealth. He had watched enough. He had been patient long enough. The sound of the whips cracking through the air was a familiar one, a sound that had become a backdrop to his life. But today was different. Today, the crack of the whip would not be the only sound in the fields. Jihari's mind wandered to the past, to the first days he had arrived on this plantation as a young boy. He had been just another commodity, just another body to work the fields. They had called him a slave, but in his heart, he had never been one. Not truly. The word had been meant to break him, to strip him of his humanity, but it had failed. They could chain his body, but they could not chain his mind. He had learned quickly that survival on the plantation was about more than just labor. It was about knowing when to speak, when to be invisible, when to bow your head and keep your mouth shut. It was about knowing how to move in the shadows, how to disappear when the overseer's gaze turned your way. But most of all, it was about waiting for the right moment. The moment when the chains of fear could be broken. That moment had arrived. The body of Talia, a fellow slave, was still fresh in his mind. He had seen her punished for the smallest of infractions, a broken basket, a spilled bucket of water, and the punishment had been swift, violent. Talia had been whipped until her back was nothing but a bloody mess, her screams lost in the winds that howled across the fields. She had died not long after. It wasn't just the death of Talia that had set something inside Jihari alight. It was the look on her face before she died, the look of helplessness, of a woman who had accepted her fate because that was all she knew how to do. But Jihari had seen something else in her death. He had seen the face of a system that was designed to break them, to keep them under its heel until they no longer had the strength to fight back. Jihari would not let that happen. He stood now in the middle of the cane fields, the sweltering sun beating down on him, but the heat was no longer what he felt. The air around him was thick with something else, the weight of a decision, a choice that would change everything. He had been patient, but patience had only brought more death, more suffering. Now, it was time to act. He heard the overseer's voice, shouting an order to the slaves. The whip cracked, and another man screamed. But the sound no longer filled him with fear. It filled him with something else. Resolve. Pedro, a fellow slave who worked beside him, was the next to feel the sting of the whip. Jihari's gaze followed the overseer's hand as it rose to strike again. But this time, Jihari didn't look away. He watched the overseer's arm move, the whip descending toward Pedro's back. In that moment, Jihari made his choice. He stepped forward, his feet sure beneath him, and before the overseer could react, Jihari's hand shot out, grabbing the handle of the cane knife that hung at his side. With one swift motion, he drew the blade from its sheath. The overseer's face twisted in surprise, but it was too late. Jihari was faster. The cane knife sliced through the air, its blade flashing in the morning light. The overseer let out a gasp as the knife cut across his throat, the blood spraying across the field like a crimson wave. He dropped to the ground, his hand clutching at the gaping wound. But it was too late. He was dead. The world seemed to stop for a moment. The other slaves stood frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief. The whip had fallen silent. The air was still. Pedro, who had been on the receiving end of the overseer's cruelty, now stood free of his tormentor. His body trembled, but his eyes, like the others, were filled with something new, something dangerous. Jihari turned, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had acted, and now there was no going back. The plantation that had kept them in chains was no longer a place of safety for their oppressors. The fire of rebellion had been ignited, but this was just the beginning. There would be no more hiding, no more waiting. The revolution had begun. The days dragged on in the fields, the sun continuing its harsh reign over the land. Pedro, the overseer, and the other slaves worked endlessly under the oppressive heat. But for Jihari, each day was no longer about survival. It was about preparation. The years of torment, of watching his people broken and beaten, had come to a head. His body was still strong, but his mind was sharper than ever. He could feel the moment of reckoning drawing near, and in his hands, the cane knife became more than just a tool of labor. It became his weapon, his means of liberation. Pedro and the other slaves worked in silence, the overseers keeping a careful watch from the distance. But Jihari's mind was elsewhere, constantly turning over the plan he had been building in the back of his mind for years. He had watched the masters, the overseers, the way they moved, the way they treated him and his people. He had seen the cracks in their system, the weaknesses in their cruelty, and now, with the blade of the cane knife in his hand, those cracks would turn into chasms. Every night, when the plantation had quieted down and the only sounds were the whispering winds through the cane, Jihari practiced. The blade became an extension of his body, and his focus grew with every swing. The sound of the steel cutting through the air was a sound of rebellion. His hands, calloused from years of labor, moved with precision. This was no longer just about cutting cane. This was about cutting down those who had kept them in chains. The overseer, Vicente, often walked the fields with his whip, his voice harsh as he barked orders at the slaves. But Vicente was careless. He was too sure of his power. He didn't notice how Pedro had been slowing his pace, how Jihari had begun to move with purpose, his eyes always scanning, calculating, waiting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the overseers took a break in the shade, chatting among themselves. The work was almost done, and the heat of the day was starting to subside. The slaves, their bodies drenched in sweat, were allowed a moment of respite. Jihari used that moment, slipping his cane knife from its sheath, feeling the cold steel of it in his hand. It was time. He walked past the workers, his gaze steady, his steps deliberate. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet anticipation of what was to come. He knew the risk. He knew that the consequences of this moment would be dire, but the opportunity had arrived, and Jihari was not one to waste it. He reached the overseers, who were laughing loudly, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Jihari's grip tightened on the knife. His heart beat in his chest, slow and steady. He felt a strange calmness wash over him. The years of torment, the years of suffering, this was the moment when it all came to an end. The blade would cut through the air, cutting through the life of the man who had tormented him and his people for so long. With a quick, fluid motion, Jihari brought the cane knife down on Vicente's back. The overseer let out a gasp, his body jerking in shock. But it was too late. The blade had already sunk deep into his flesh. Jihari twisted the knife, his arms steady, his heart cold. The overseer crumpled to the ground, his scream lost in the night air. The other overseers turned in shock, but they didn't react fast enough. Jihari was already moving again, the knife in his hand flashing through the air. One by one, he took them down, swift, precise, merciless. The guards who had once held the power of life and death over them were now the ones dying in the fields they had once controlled. Pedro stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide as he watched the death unfold before him. But then something changed in him, something awakened. He had been waiting for this moment, but now he felt the power shift. The fear that had once gripped him began to dissolve, replaced by something stronger, hope. Jihari paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the fallen bodies of the overseers. He knew that this was just the beginning. The plan was still in motion. They had taken out the guards, but there was still the master to deal with. Senhor Rocha, the man who had enslaved him and the others, still lived in the grand house, untouched by the blood that had been spilled in the fields. But now, it didn't seem impossible. Jihari had struck the first blow, and he had shown the others that it could be done. The power was theirs, if only they had the courage to take it. "Gather the others," Jihari said, his voice low but filled with command. He could hear the sounds of the slaves stirring behind him, their movements quiet but eager. The time had come. It was time to move on the master's house. As they made their way through the plantation, Jihari's thoughts were sharp and clear. The rebellion was not just about killing the overseers, not just about taking the life of Senhor Rocha. It was about something much greater. It was about freedom. It was about taking back what had been stolen from them, their dignity, their families, their lives. And that was something no master, no overseer, could ever take away again. They reached the master's house, the large white walls gleaming in the moonlight. The house stood tall and proud, a symbol of everything they had fought against. Jihari could see the guards patrolling the grounds, unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. He motioned for the others to stay low, and they moved through the shadows, silent as ghosts. The final step was here. The master's house would fall, and with it, the chains that had bound them for so long would finally be broken. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, a mixture that clung to the earth like a curse. Jihari's heart pounded in his chest as he and his group crept toward the grand house, their footsteps soft and deliberate, blending into the night's shadows. The plan was simple, but it was dangerous. They had taken down the overseers, but the final step, the hardest step, remained. The master, Senhor Rocha, a man of wealth and power, had built his estate on the backs of slaves like Jihari. The house, with its polished walls and towering columns, was a monument to everything that had been wrong with the world they had known. It represented the height of their oppression, the wealth and luxury of their masters, bought at the expense of their pain. But tonight, the power was no longer in the hands of the masters. The slaves had taken control of the fields, and now they would take control of the house. Jihari signaled for the others to halt, and they crouched behind the tall hedges that lined the estate, their eyes scanning the area. The guards were still patrolling the grounds, but they were few and unaware of the rebellion that had already begun. Jihari's plan was coming to fruition, and soon the house would be theirs. Zainab, ever calm and composed, stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. "There's one guard at the back entrance," she said in a whisper. "He's alone." Jihari nodded. They would need to move quickly, decisively. They couldn't afford to waste any time. The longer they stayed out in the open, the greater the chance of being discovered. Without another word, they moved in silence, slipping through the shadows. Jihari's mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. The blade of the cane knife felt familiar in his hand, and he gripped it tightly. The cold steel a reminder of the vengeance that had driven him this far. As they approached the back entrance, the lone guard appeared in the distance, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Jihari motioned for the others to remain still, then crept forward with a predator's quiet steps. His heart was steady, his breath even, as he closed the gap between himself and the guard. The guard was unaware of the danger, his focus on the surroundings, perhaps distracted by the faint sounds of the night. Jihari was close now, just a few steps away. The guard turned, and for a moment, their eyes met. It was a brief exchange, a moment of realization. The guard's hand moved toward his weapon, but it was too late. With a swift motion, Jihari's cane knife cut through the air, plunging deep into the guard's chest. The man gasped in shock, but there was no scream, only a gurgled breath as he fell to the ground. Jihari stood over him for a moment, his breath steady, his mind clear. The guard was dead, and the way to the house was now open. The others quickly followed, their movements fluid and practiced. The silence was deafening, but in the midst of it, Jihari felt an undeniable feeling that had been building in him for years. This was not just about killing. This was about taking back control. This was about freedom. They reached the back door of the master's house, and Jihari signaled for Zainab to take point. She moved with quiet efficiency, slipping inside the house first, her eyes alert for any sign of danger. The rest of the group followed closely behind. The interior of the house was like a palace, its marble floors gleaming in the low light. Its rich tapestries and furniture, a stark contrast to the dirt and dust of the plantation. Jihari's eyes moved across the opulence, but he felt nothing but disgust. This was the house that had housed his tormentors, the house where his people had been worked to death and treated like animals. The luxury around him was nothing but a reminder of the cruelty that had shaped his life. They moved through the house silently, taking out the few guards who remained, one by one, with the same quiet precision they had used in the fields. Each step brought them closer to their target, Senor Rocha. Jihari could feel the weight of the man's life hanging in the balance. This was it. The final reckoning. They reached the master's study, where Senor Rocha sat behind a large desk, his back turned to the door. He was unaware of the rebellion that had torn through his plantation. He was unaware that his world was about to crumble. Jihari's heart beat steadily as he stepped forward, his hand tightening around the knife. This was it. The end of the road. The moment of justice. With a single motion, Jihari swung the door open, the sound of it creaking in the silence of the night. Senor Rocha turned, his eyes widening in shock as he saw the rebels standing before him, the blood of his overseers still fresh on their hands. "You," Rocha spat, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You think you can take everything from me?" Jihari's gaze never wavered as he stepped forward, his voice cold and unwavering. "You took everything from us, Rocha. Your life is the price for that." Before the master could respond, Jihari lunged forward. The cane knife cut through the air, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The knife found its mark, deep in Rocha's chest, and the man's body crumpled to the floor, his wealth and power ending with a single stroke. The house fell silent. The plantation, once a symbol of oppression, was now theirs. The master, the overseers, and the system that had kept them in chains had all been brought down in one swift, brutal act. But for Jihari, it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. The war for their freedom had only just begun. The moment the master's body hit the floor, a strange calm washed over the house. The power had shifted. For the first time in their lives, the slaves who had long toiled in silence were in control. The silence that followed Senor Rocha's death was not one of relief but of foreboding, a quiet before the storm. Jihari stood over the fallen master, the blood still fresh on the floor, his chest rising and falling steadily, but inside, his mind was already racing. The rebellion was not yet won, and their freedom was still far from guaranteed. Zainab stepped forward first, her eyes scanning the room, her body poised for action. She had been with Jihari from the start, a trusted ally in this dangerous game, and now she moved to secure the estate. The others followed her lead, fanning out through the grand house. There was no time to celebrate the victory. They had killed the master, but the war for freedom was far from over. Outside, the chaos of the revolt still echoed through the plantation. Screams filled the air as the remaining overseers and guards were taken down. The rebellion had spread like wildfire, and the sound of fighting of a world being torn apart was both terrifying and exhilarating. But there was something else in the air now, something darker. The cost of their rebellion had already begun to show itself. The air was thick with the scent of blood, and it was clear that the masters would not let their empire fall without retaliation. What had started as a single act of vengeance had now become a battle for survival. Jihari and Zainab moved quickly, her voice low as she spoke to him, her tone urgent. "We need to act fast. The guards will regroup. The other plantations will hear about this, and they'll come for us." Jihari nodded, his eyes flicking toward the windows. The morning light was beginning to break through the trees, casting long shadows over the plantation. It had taken hours to reach this point, and now, as the first rays of dawn touched the estate, the fight had shifted. They had killed the head, but the body remained, and there would be no peace until it was finished. "Gather the others," Jihari said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decisions ahead. "We need to take control of the entire plantation. If we're going to survive, we must destroy every symbol of their power." Zainab didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, giving orders to the other rebels. As they worked together to secure the house, Jihari's mind turned inward. He had thought that killing Senhor Rocha would be the end, the act that would signal the beginning of their freedom. But now he realized that freedom wasn't so simple. The masters had built their system over generations. Killing one man would not undo the centuries of cruelty that had been inflicted on them. The house was silent now, save for the hushed voices of the rebels as they secured every door, every room. The sound of movement above them signaled the search for survivors. They had not yet finished their task, and the threat of retaliation loomed over them like a dark cloud. But for the first time, the rebels stood united, strong, and undeterred by the fear that had once held them in chains. Jihari stepped to the window and looked out over the plantation. The field stretched out before him, vast and endless. He could see the other slaves working in the fields, their heads down, their bodies hunched over the cane, just as they had always done. But there was something different now. The power had shifted. The world they knew had been torn apart in one night, and as much as the masters would fight to keep their control, Jihari knew that this was the beginning of the end. "Gather the slaves," Jihari said, his voice sharp. "Tell them to rise. We take this plantation tonight." The rebels moved through the estate, making sure every room was clear, securing the arms and supplies they needed for the next phase of the battle. The slaves who had been working the fields, those who had watched the death of the overseers from a distance, were brought in. There was no longer any hiding. They would stand with Jihari, or they would fall. Zainab and Maria went to the barracks, telling the slaves there that the time had come. The word spread quickly, whispers, shouts, and cries of defiance. The workers, once docile and broken, now felt the taste of vengeance on their tongues. The rebellion had ignited something in them, a fire that could not be extinguished. Jihari stood in the middle of the plantation, watching as the slaves gathered around him. They had seen the fall of their masters. They had seen their brothers and sisters rise up in defiance. Now, they were ready to fight not just for their lives, but for their freedom. But as they gathered in the shadows, ready to march out into the fields, there was no celebration. There was only the grim reality of what lay ahead. This rebellion had cost them something already. Lives had been lost, and many more would be before the fight was done. But the cost of inaction, of staying silent, was far greater. The time for hesitation was over. It was time to strike back. Jihari looked to Zainab. She had been by his side from the beginning, and he knew that they would fight until the very end. together. But even with his strength and resolve, he understood that the price of this rebellion would be high. They had come this far, but the battle was far from over. There were still masters out there, waiting to crush them, waiting to punish them for daring to defy the system that had kept them in chains for so long. And then, in the distance, he heard the sound of horses' hooves, the echo of the master's final attempt to regain control. The cavalry had arrived. It was time. The rumble of hooves reverberated through the soil beneath Jihari's feet. As the sound of the approaching cavalry grew louder, he could hear them, dozens of riders, their boots heavy on the ground, the clinking of armor and weapons clear in the still morning air. The master's forces had arrived. They had come to crush the rebellion, to remind the slaves of their place. But Jihari had no intention of surrendering. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. He stood at the front of the gathered slaves, his eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the cane knife that had become his symbol of vengeance. His pulse quickened, but there was no fear. There could be no fear now. The time for running had passed. This was their moment. This was the battle that would decide the fate of everything. Zainab, Maria, and the other leaders moved through the ranks, their voices low, offering quiet encouragement and final instructions. The slaves were ready. But Jihari knew that readiness alone would not win the battle. They needed strategy, they needed strength, and above all, they needed unity. The rebellion had started with one act of defiance, but now it was a full-scale war, and it would take everything they had to stand against the might of the masters. The first wave of cavalry appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes growing clearer in the dawn light. The horses' hooves struck the earth like a warning, a sound of impending doom. But to Jihari and the slaves, it was a rallying cry, a call to arms. "We fight for our freedom," Jihari said, his voice strong and resolute. His words carried across the field, filling the slaves with a new sense of purpose. "We fight for our families, for our lives. This is not just about today. This is about every day we've spent in chains. This is the moment we take back what was stolen from us." The slaves raised their makeshift weapons, pitchforks, knives, broken spears, anything they could wield. Jihari's gaze locked onto the cavalry as they neared. The cavalry had the advantage in numbers and weapons, but Jihari had something they didn't: the will to fight. He turned to Zainab. "Stay close. We fight together." Zainab nodded, her eyes sharp, her stance unwavering. She had been with him from the beginning, and together they had planned every step of this rebellion. Now, the moment of truth had arrived. There would be no turning back. The cavalry was upon them, charging at full speed, their swords raised, ready to strike. The slaves braced themselves, their feet planted firmly in the dirt, their weapons held high. Jihari's heart beat like a drum in his chest, his breath steady as he prepared for the collision of worlds, the world of the masters and the world of the slaves. The first clash was brutal. The sound of metal against metal, the cries of battle, the thundering of hooves as the horses charged through the ranks of the slaves. It all happened in an instant. Jihari ducked as one of the riders swung his sword at him, the blade missing by mere inches. With lightning speed, Jihari thrust his cane knife forward, the blade sinking into the horse's flank, bringing the beast to a halt. The rider fell, his body crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. The slaves fought with everything they had, their fear replaced by rage. Each blow struck with the weight of years of suffering. They had nothing left to lose, and they fought as if the very fate of their souls depended on it. They were no longer slaves, they were warriors, and they would not be silenced again. Zainab fought beside Jihari, her movements swift and deadly. She parried a blow from one of the riders, her knife slicing through the air, striking him down in a single motion. Maria, who had fought with fire in her eyes since the first blow was struck, moved like a storm, cutting down those who dared to approach her. The battle was chaotic, a swirling mix of blood, sweat, and determination. The cavalry, once so sure of their victory, began to falter as the slaves fought back with a ferocity that none of them had expected. But even as they made their stand, Jihari knew the battle was far from won. The cavalry kept coming, relentless, a force of nature. They were trained soldiers, and while the slaves were fighting with everything they had, They lacked the same level of experience and weaponry. Jihari's eyes scanned the battlefield. The slaves were holding their own, but the tide was beginning to turn. The cavalry's numbers were overwhelming, and the slaves' resolve, though strong, was beginning to waver. But in that moment of doubt, Jihari saw something that gave him hope. The other slaves were fighting not just for themselves, but for each other, for their families, for their freedom. And in that unity, they had something the cavalry did not, the fire of rebellion. He turned to Zainab, his voice low. "We need to push them back. We fight for every life here." Zainab nodded, her eyes fierce. "We'll fight until the last man falls." The battle raged on, but Jihari's resolve did not waver. He fought with every ounce of strength he had, his body moving on instinct, the blade of his cane knife finding its mark again and again. The cavalry may have had more weapons, more training, but the slaves had the one thing that could not be taken from them, the will to survive. Jihari's mind raced. They could not hold out forever. The slaves were outnumbered, and even with their newfound strength, they would not be able to defeat the cavalry if they stayed on the defensive. It was time to act. "Push forward!" Jihari shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "Take them to the fields! Don't let them regroup!" With that, the slaves surged forward, driving the cavalry back into the plantation fields. They fought with the desperation of men and women who had nothing to lose. Each step was a step toward freedom. Each swing of the blade a chance to take back their lives. As the battle raged on, Jihari knew that this was only the beginning. The war for freedom had started with the blood of the overseers, but it would end with the blood of those who had built their empire on the backs of the enslaved. The fight was far from over, but Jihari and his people had shown the world that they would not be beaten, not any longer. The battlefield was a sea of bodies, blood, and smoke. The sound of clashing swords and cries of the fallen echoed across the plantation. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the field, and yet the fight raged on as if time itself had suspended its cruel march. Jihari's heart thudded in his chest, but his mind remained sharp, his focus unbroken. The battle had been fierce, more brutal than he could have ever imagined. But the tide was finally beginning to shift in their favor. The slaves, once cowering in fear, had now become a force to be reckoned with. The cavalry, though trained and well-armed, had underestimated the strength of the enslaved people they had so long oppressed. Their confidence had faltered in the face of such ferocity. Jihari had seen it in their eyes, the same fear that had once been in his own, the fear of losing control. But now, they were losing it. With each passing minute, the balance of power continued to tip in favor of the slaves. They had pushed the cavalry back, the plantation grounds now a battlefield, where victory was no longer a question of if, but when. Jihari, covered in the grime and blood of the fight, stood tall, his eyes scanning the field for any signs of the remaining threats. He could see Zainab fighting fiercely by his side, her movements swift and deliberate, cutting down anyone who dared approach. Maria, too, was moving like a tempest, her knife flashing in the sun as she cleaved through the ranks of the cavalry. The others, Pedro, Samuel, and the rest had proven their resolve, each of them fighting with everything they had, determined to end this once and for all. But it wasn't over yet. The cavalry had retreated to the far end of the estate, regrouping, preparing for one final charge. Jihari knew this was their last chance, their one opportunity to break the back of the master's forces. They had the advantage now, but it wouldn't last forever. The cavalry would strike again. This battle had only just begun, but this moment, this single moment, could change everything. "We need to push them back now," Jihari shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not let them regroup." With his words, the slaves surged forward, their weapons raised, their faces hardened with determination. Jihari led the charge, his cane knife in hand, cutting through the air with a deadly precision. They moved as one, a wave of fury and defiance that would not be stopped. The cavalry, now disorganized and retreating, had no choice but to meet the force head-on. They had once been the masters, the rulers of the land. But now, they were the ones fighting for survival. Jihari and his fellow rebels fought with a single purpose in mind: to end the reign of terror that had been forced upon them for so long. They had no fear of death. In fact, They welcomed it because death was nothing compared to the life they had lived under the master's rule. They had already died in their hearts. Now, they were reborn. The slaves fought with a brutal, unrelenting force, pressing the cavalry back. Jihari's hands were slick with blood, his body tired, but his spirit burned with an intensity that nothing could extinguish. He was no longer just a man fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for all of them, his brothers, his sisters, the ones who had fallen before him. This was their moment. This was their war. As the battle wore on, the cavalry began to break. Their formation shattered under the weight of the slaves' fury. The sound of hooves, once so confident, now echoed in panic as the soldiers attempted to flee. It was too late. The momentum had shifted. The slaves had them on the run. Jihari could see the master's estate in the distance, the grand house where it had all started. It was now a symbol of what had been destroyed, of what they had taken back. The walls of the house, once a monument to the power of the masters, stood tall in the distance. But Jihari knew that their time was over. The plantation would burn, and with it, the chains that had bound them all. As the last of the cavalry was driven back, Jihari stood amidst the smoke and chaos, his body battered but unbowed. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The plantation was theirs, but the fight for true freedom, freedom from fear, from oppression, from the chains of the past was just beginning. Zainab approached him, her eyes meeting his with a look of understanding. She too was covered in blood, but she was alive, and so were they. "It's over," she said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of what they had just accomplished. Jihari shook his head. "It's not over yet. We've only just begun." They stood together for a moment, watching as the last remnants of the master's forces retreated into the distance, knowing that the plantation, once a symbol of oppression, was now theirs to rebuild. The road ahead would be hard. There would be more battles to fight, but for the first time, they had hope. The flames of the revolt would burn brightly, and in their light, they would build a new world, one where they were free, where the shackles of the past could never bind them again.